Signor Presidente della Repubblica, Ministro Orlando, Sua Eminenza, Presidente del Senato, Signore e Signori, ladies and gentlemen, I am really delighted to be here with you today to discuss with you detention conditions and alternative methods of sentencing. Detention conditions are primarily the responsibility of the member states, but these issues also concern the European Union. In a number of EU member states, prison conditions are below the standards set by the Council of Europe. And some member states have even been condemned by the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. Poor conditions in Europe are mostly the result of prison overcrowding. Statistics show that more than half of the 28 member states have a prison occupancy rate of more than 100%. Italy has an occupancy rate now of 105%, and 4 member states still have occupancy rates above 120%. The downsides of incarceration are obvious. People serving prison sentences cannot continue to work. They cannot complete their education or support their families. Moreover, the stigma of detention makes it difficult for people to reintegrate into society after their release from prison. And last but not least, prisons are very expensive. On average, 1 day of detention in the EU costs €95. In some member states, poor prison conditions result from the bad state of prison facilities. In 2015, Italy and 11 other member states asked the European Commission to look into the opportunities for the modernization of prisons using money from the European Regional Development Fund. There are indeed ways of using EU structural funds to improve sanitary conditions in prisons. Under this fund, energy efficiency priority funding is available for the installation of central heating, domestic hot water, ventilation and insulation. We are further exploring other options under the European Fund of Strategic Investments. There are negative effects of incarceration and overcrowding on rehabilitation. Many prisoners have mental health issues, which only get worse in a prison environment. Keeping in mind that the majority of prisoners will be released one day, mental health issues have to be addressed. Detaining more people is also not financially sustainable in the long term. Improving prison conditions has become a political priority because of the danger of radicalization in prisons. Terrorist attacks are increasingly linked to radicalization in prisons. Young people who might be first-time offenders ending up in prison for minor crimes are particularly vulnerable to radicalization and indoctrination. Just imagine charismatic leaders and the gang culture in prisons make them easy targets for recruitment. If managed and resourced properly, prisons can play a positive role in tackling and preventing radicalization and terrorism. There is also evidence that poor detention conditions in member states create obstacles to mutual recognition instruments in the European Union. So far, 2 EU legal instruments have a direct link to detention conditions. These are, first, the European arrest warrant, and second, the EU framework on the transfer of prisoners, which allows prisoners to be transferred back to their home country in the interest of their social rehabilitation. We see more and more refusals to extradite suspects from the EU member state to another because of overcrowded prisons. In July last year, a German court asked questions to the European Court of Justice as to whether it could refuse the extradition of a person under the European arrest warrant due to the poor prison conditions in Hungary, following a ruling of the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. 2 weeks ago, the court gave its answer. It ruled that the execution of a European arrest warrant must be deferred if there is a real risk of inhuman or degrading treatment because of the detention conditions in the member state that issued the warrant. Member states may be required to provide assurances on the prison facilities where the surrendered person will be held. This means that member states can no longer turn a blind eye to detention conditions in other member states. Instead, they need to apply diligence in terms of fundamental rights if member states have been condemned for overcrowding or poor detention conditions. The European Convention of Human Rights and the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights also stipulate that people cannot be transferred to another country if that would imply inhuman or degrading treatment. Judges have to face this dilemma when extraditing people. Let me now come shortly to another topic, which is pre-trial detention. In some member states, the proportion of pre-trial detainees amounts to half of the prison population, compared to the EU average of 21%. This, in turn, worsens overcrowding and poor detention conditions. The length of pre-trial detention varies greatly from one member state to another. In some countries, it is a few months, while in some others, it may take several years before the actual trial takes place. Pre-trial detention is often the default option, while it should be a measure of last resort, according to the case law of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, and taking into account the presumption of innocence. Alternatives should be considered first, but even if alternatives exist in the legislation, judges rarely use them. We are currently looking into these issues. We are working on a comparative law study, which we will finalize very soon. Because of the issues I just described, the EU has an interest in alternative methods of sentencing. Indeed, we are looking at ways to reduce prison overcrowding across Europe. Almost 50% of prisoners in the EU serve a short-term sentence of less than 3 years, while the most common offenses are theft and drug offenses, almost 40%. Of these offenders with short-term prison sentences, 60% will re-offend within 1 year after release. We are also particularly interested in what new technologies can offer. Electronic monitoring opens up new possibilities for sentencing. For example, electronic monitoring could help reduce short prison sentences, support early release arrangements, and avoid pretrial detention. People could work at their normal workplace during the day and come back to prison in the evening or during the weekend. They can keep their full-time job or continue their education and care for their families. It would be useful to share data and to learn from each other's experiences. These exchanges of good practice are also interesting to find out why some alternatives do work in some member states, but not in others. One example would be the release on bail, which is a very successful instrument in the United Kingdom and Ireland, and seems to exist also in many civil law legislations, but is practically never used. Alternative sentencing methods, such as restorative justice, victim-offender mediation, or financial penalties, are also worth discussing. The same goes for offender rehabilitation, reintegration of former prisoners into society, and the role of probation post-release, in particular for those member states where probation services have been set up only recently. National policies on early and conditional release and detention regimes of vulnerable groups, such as children, women, and persons with mental health issues, are also very important. Such an exchange would also have a positive impact on the operation of the EU rules on detention. For the good functioning of EU framework decisions, sound knowledge of the application of probation and alternative sanctions is key, both in the pre- and the post-trial stage. I am reflecting on setting up a high-level expert group allowing member states to exchange experiences on these issues on a more regular basis. The recommendations of such a group could also feed into the EU policy making. There is a lack of reliable data in this field. Exact data on the use of alternative sanctions are really hard to obtain. That is why the European Commission will be providing a direct grant to the Council of Europe this year for the collection of statistics on prisons and community sanctions and measures. Ladies and gentlemen, this conference is very important as it opens the discussion about alternative methods of sentencing. I wish you very interesting discussions today and tomorrow, which we hopefully can soon replicate at the European level. Thank you very much.